Hollywood execs lost millions, directors got blacklisted, and theaters literally had their film reels confiscated. The 1960s wasn't just about peace and love. It was when filmmakers pushed boundaries so far that entire studios faced financial ruin. Which controversial masterpiece nearly bankrupted a major studio? Which film triggered actual riots outside theaters? Let's find out. Number 12. The Sergeant, 1968. This military drama tackled taboos nobody was ready for. Rod Steiger plays a decorated master sergeant stationed in France who develops complicated feelings for a handsome young private. Warner Brothers knew exactly what they were getting into and still greenlit it, only to panic when religious groups threatened nationwide boycotts. Behind the scenes, the studio desperately tried rewriting the ending to make it more acceptable, but director John Flynn refused to budge. The studio's compromise? They buried it, with minimal marketing and a limited release pattern that guaranteed box office disaster. Critics were divided. Some called it groundbreaking, while others labeled it morally reprehensible. Steiger later admitted he lost multiple roles after this film. Directors would tell my agent they loved my work but couldn't risk the association, he revealed in a 1975 interview. The film barely made back a third of its budget, and Warner Brothers faced protests at their offices for months. Theater owners in the South and Midwest flat out refused to screen it. What makes The Sergeant fascinating today isn't just its ahead-of-its-time subject matter, but how it refuses to sensationalize its story. It's a character study first, controversial statement second. When the American Legion called for a complete boycott of all Warner films in response, the studio backed down, releasing a public statement distancing themselves from the film's message, a move Steiger called the most cowardly thing I've ever witnessed in this industry. Number 11. Victim, 1961. Before homosexuality was decriminalized in Britain, this British thriller blew the doors off the closet. Dirk Bogarde risked his entire matinee idol career to play a successful lawyer, being blackmailed over his private life. United Artists executives initially refused to distribute it in America, claiming audiences wouldn't understand the subject matter. The film's financial backers were so nervous about boycotts, they insisted on script changes right up until filming began. Bogarde stood firm, reportedly telling producers, "I'm not playing a saint. I'm playing a man." When it finally hit theaters, Catholic organizations across America called for total boycotts of any theater showing it. The MPAA initially denied it a seal of approval, effectively blocking mainstream release. The film made decent money in art house circuits, but was banned outright in several states. Theater owners who defied the bans faced license revocations, and in one documented case in Chicago, a theater owner was arrested for promoting indecency. Critics eventually recognized its importance. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called it a significant social document of its time. Bogarde's career temporarily stalled, but he later said it was the only film I'm genuinely proud of. Victim became the first English-language film to use the word homosexual on screen, and British lawmakers later cited it during debates that led to decriminalization in 1967. Number 10. The Pawnbroker, 1964. Holocaust trauma depicted so brutally that theaters walked away. Rod Steiger plays a concentration camp survivor running a pawn shop in Harlem, emotionally dead inside and haunted by flashbacks. Director Sidney Lumet included brief scenes that broke Hollywood's strict nudity taboo, triggering an industry earthquake. The Production Code Administration refused classification, meaning major theater chains wouldn't touch it. Paramount almost dropped the distribution deal entirely, terrified of association. American Legion posts organized picket lines. Religious groups threatened boycotts of all Paramount films if they released it uncut. What saved it? The film found unlikely champions in prominent Jewish and Catholic intellectuals who argued its artistic merit transcended concerns about content. Allied artists eventually took distribution rights, and it became the first American film released without production code approval since the 1930s, effectively beginning the code's downfall. Critics recognized its power immediately. Pauline Kael called it a landmark in American film. It lost money domestically, but found audiences abroad. Steiger earned an Oscar nomination despite the controversy. When asked years later about the film's reception, Lumet said, "We made exactly the film we wanted to make. The system had to change because art demanded it. Theater chains that refused to show it faced public criticism for moral cowardice, with several eventually reversing their decisions. Number 9. Bonnie and Clyde, 1967. Warner Brothers thought they were getting a cheap gangster flick. What they got was a stylish bloodbath that rewrote Hollywood's rules on violence. Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway portray the notorious bank robbers as glamorous anti-heroes, and the studio immediately feared audience backlash. Jack Warner himself hated it, reportedly walking out of the first screening muttering, "That's the worst film I've ever seen." The studio dumped it with minimal promotion, expecting quick failure. Initial reviews were brutal. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called it a cheap piece of bald-faced slapstick comedy that treats the hideous depredations of that sleazy, moronic pair as though they were as full of fun and frolic as the jazz-age cut-ups. Parent groups organized boycotts. The American Legion condemned it for glorifying criminals. Religious organizations called it moral pollution. But something unexpected happened. Young audiences loved it. Word of mouth spread. Warner Brothers reluctantly expanded its release, and it became a cultural phenomenon. The slow-motion death scene finale sparked fierce debate about cinematic violence. Studio executives who initially buried the film suddenly claimed credit for its success. It earned 10 Oscar nominations and transformed Hollywood's approach to anti-heroes. Director Arthur Penn later revealed that Warner Brothers had tried cutting the violent scenes without his permission, only backing down when Beatty threatened legal action. "They wanted us to sanitize history," Penn said. "We refused." Number 8. Blowup, 1966. MGM expected an art house curiosity. They got a controversial masterpiece that had American censors reaching for their scissors. Michelangelo Antonioni's first English-language film follows a fashion photographer who may have accidentally captured a murder. Its casual approach to intimacy and substances pushed boundaries nobody knew existed. The film went to Cannes without production code approval, a deliberate strategy by producer Carlo Ponti to force MGM's hand. When it won the Palme d'Or, the studio was trapped. They had a prestigious award winner they couldn't easily distribute in America. Religious groups immediately called for boycotts. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it as morally objectionable. MGM formed Premiere Productions specifically to release films without code approval, essentially creating a loophole in their own system. Theater owners faced picketers and boycott threats. Some cinema chains refused to show it entirely. Despite the controversy, or because of it, Blowup became a massive hit, grossing over $20 million on a $1.8 million budget. Critics were divided, but mostly impressed. Time magazine called it a masterly feat of elliptical editing. The film's success helped end the production code entirely, paving the way for the MPAA rating system. When asked why he made such a provocative film, Antonioni simply replied, "I don't discuss symbols. I create them." The Supreme Court eventually ruled in its favor in obscenity challenges, citing artistic merit, a landmark decision for film censorship. Number 7. Titicut Falls, 1967. This documentary exposed such horrific conditions in a Massachusetts mental institution that the state literally banned it for 25 years. Director Frederick Wiseman filmed inmates being force-fed through tubes, stripped naked by guards, and housed in squalid conditions. No studio would touch it. It was independently produced and distributed. The state of Massachusetts filed an injunction claiming the film violated patient privacy, the first time a film was banned in America for reasons other than obscenity or national security. A judge agreed, restricting viewings to professionals in legal, medical, or social work fields only. The real reason? Officials were terrified of public outrage over conditions they'd permitted. Wiseman fought the ban for decades. Critics who managed to see it at special screenings were shocked. Vincent Canby of the New York Times called it a remarkable movie, an extraordinarily candid document. The controversy cost Wiseman financially. He spent over $200,000 in legal fees fighting the ban. What's truly shocking is how authorities attacked the messenger rather than fixing the problem. The ban wasn't fully lifted until 1991, making it America's most successfully censored film. When it finally received wider distribution, Roger Ebert wrote, "The film's long suppression says more about our society than the film itself says about the hospital." The institution it documented was eventually shut down, but not until 1976, nearly a decade after the film was made. Number 6. Peeping Tom, 1960. This psychological thriller destroyed its director's career overnight. Michael Powell made the fatal mistake of creating a sympathetic portrait of a murderer who films his victims' deaths. The premise alone triggered outrage before most critics had even seen it. British critics savaged it with unprecedented viciousness. The Sunday Express critic wrote that the film should be flushed down the nearest sewer. Theaters rapidly canceled bookings after religious groups threatened boycotts. Anglo Amalgamated, the studio behind it, pulled promotional support almost immediately. Michael Powell, previously considered one of Britain's greatest directors, became unhireable. His next planned production lost financing within weeks of Peeping Tom's release. The film lost a fortune, barely making £20,000 on its £145,000 budget. It was pulled from theaters so quickly that most audiences never got the chance to see it. The tragic irony? It's now considered a masterpiece of psychological horror. Martin Scorsese later championed its restoration and re-release, calling it one of the most frightening films ever made. Powell never fully recovered professionally. When asked in the 1970s about the film's reception, he said, "I made a film that nobody wanted to see," before adding with typical defiance, "But I still think it's my best work." Number 5. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? 1966. Warner Brothers gambled their reputation on a film so profane it changed Hollywood's language rules forever. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton verbally eviscerate each other through a night of psychological warfare, using language that had never been permitted on American screens. Jack Warner himself almost shelved it, fearing nationwide boycotts. The Production Code Administration demanded 18 specific cuts, including removing the phrase "hump the hostess" entirely. Director Mike Nichols refused most changes, and Jack Warner, seeing the film's potential, backed him. Religious organizations immediately called for boycotts of all Warner films. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it as morally objectionable. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Critics were stunned by its power. The film earned 13 Oscar nominations and won 5, including Best Actress for Taylor. It grossed $30 million on a $7.5 million budget, despite being restricted to viewers over 18 in many theaters. Some theater owners still refuse to show it, calling it verbal pornography. The film's success directly led to the abandonment of the production code in favor of the MPAA rating system. Jack Warner, initially terrified of the controversy, later boasted about standing up to censors. When Taylor was asked about the film's language, she famously replied, "I don't give a damn what they think. This is how people really talk when they're hurting each other." Number 4. Psycho, 1960. Paramount refused to finance it, so Alfred Hitchcock mortgaged his own house. The studio thought a film showing a toilet flush, let alone a brutal murder, would trigger boycotts nationwide. They were right, and completely wrong about what would happen next. Hitchcock bought the rights to Robert Bloch's novel anonymously for just $9,000. Knowing the content would terrify studios. When Paramount finally agreed to distribute but not finance the film, they demanded extensive cuts. Hitchcock submitted to censors a version with additional, more graphic footage he never intended to use, making the actual cuts seem reasonable by comparison. Religious groups predictably called for boycotts. The National Legion of Decency condemned it. Initial reviews were mixed. Many critics were shocked by its violence. Bosley Crowther called it a blot on an honorable career. Yet audiences couldn't stay away. Lines formed around blocks. The film cost $800,000 to make and earned $50 million, becoming Hitchcock's biggest hit. What's forgotten today is how Paramount tried distancing themselves from the film despite its success. Theater owners who had initially refused to book it scrambled to get prints. Hitchcock, who retained 60% ownership, became wildly wealthy from the film the studio never wanted. When asked about the controversy years later, Hitchcock simply said, "It's only a movie," with the slight smile of a man who had definitively proven the industry wrong. Number 3. Cleopatra, 1963. The film that nearly destroyed 20th Century Fox. Elizabeth Taylor's record-breaking $1 million salary was just the beginning of a production so chaotic it triggered stockholder lawsuits. The budget exploded from $2 million to over $44 million, about $390 million today, as production shut down, restarted, and changed directors. The Taylor-Burton affair that began during filming created a scandal so massive the Vatican newspaper condemned Taylor as an erotic vagrant. Conservative groups called for boycotts. Theater owners worried about protests. Fox was forced to sell off massive portions of its backlot just to stay afloat during production. Despite being the highest-grossing film of 1963 at $57.8 million, it lost so much money that Fox nearly went bankrupt. The Century City District in Los Angeles exists because Fox had to sell that land to developers to recover. Studio president Spiros Skouras lost his job over the debacle. Stockholders filed lawsuits against the studio management. Critics were mixed. Some praised its spectacle, while others called it bloated and indulgent. When director Joseph L. Mankiewicz was asked if he'd watch the film again, he famously replied, "I've already seen it. Why would I want that kind of punishment again?" The studio eventually recovered financially with The Sound of Music in 1965. But Cleopatra's legacy as the film that almost killed a major studio remains Hollywood legend. Number 2, I Am Curious, Yellow, 1967. This Swedish film became the most financially successful foreign film in American history because U.S. Customs literally seized it at the border. Director Vilgot Sjöman created a semi-documentary about a young woman exploring political activism and intimate relationships in 1960s Sweden. Its matter-of-fact approach to physical intimacy shocked American authorities. U.S. Customs confiscated the film as obscene material when distributor Grove Press tried importing it. What followed was a 3-year legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Religious groups organized nationwide protests at theaters that planned to show it. Local prosecutors in multiple states threatened theater owners with obscenity charges. The legal controversy created unprecedented publicity. When it finally received limited release in 1969, audiences lined up around blocks. It grossed over $20 million in America despite showing in relatively few theaters, the equivalent of $150 million today. Critics were divided about its merits as cinema. Roger Ebert famously wrote, I have no doubt that I Am Curious, Yellow would have been a better film if it had been made by a more talented director. The Supreme Court case became a landmark in cinema history, effectively loosening obscenity standards for films with artistic merit. Ironically, Swedish audiences considered it primarily a political film, not a particularly risque one. When asked about American reactions, director Sjöman said, "Americans seem more interested in what happens in my characters' bedrooms than in their minds." Number 1. The Wild Bunch, 1969. Sam Peckinpah's ultra-violent Western horrified critics, thrilled audiences, and changed action cinema forever. Warner Brothers executives nearly had heart attacks at the first screening. William Holden leads a gang of aging outlaws in a blood-soaked last stand that features more bullets than dialogue. The studio demanded extensive cuts to the film's violence. Peckinpah refused, threatening to disown the film if they touched it. Early test screenings saw walkouts and complaints. One executive's wife reportedly vomited during the opening massacre. The MPAA initially threatened an X rating, which would have killed its commercial prospects. Parent groups organized boycotts. Religious leaders condemned it from pulpits nationwide. Critics were polarized. Some called it a masterpiece. Others, a film of degradation. The violence particularly shocked audiences used to bloodless westerns, where men clutched their chests and fell over after being shot. Despite the controversy, it made solid money, grossing $11 million on a $6 million budget. Over time, its reputation grew. It's now considered one of the greatest westerns ever made. Peckinpah faced fierce criticism but remained defiant, saying, "I wanted to show violence in real terms." What's horrible is that we've been conditioned to accept violence in our society as long as we don't see the blood. The film's initial reception was so controversial that Warner Bros. Briefly considered shelving future violent films. Instead, its influence transformed how action was portrayed on screen. Martin Scorsese later said, "Peckinpah opened the door for the rest of us to show violence as it really is, terrible, painful, and utterly without glory." From studio near bankruptcies to Supreme Court cases, these films didn't just push boundaries, they obliterated them completely. Which controversial classic from our list surprised you most? Would these films even get made today? Or has Hollywood become too risk-averse? Let us know in the comments below. And if you think today's films are pushing boundaries, remember, they're standing on the shoulders of directors who risk their entire careers just to tell stories their way.